Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today on the real cost of staying put and why infrastructure status quo is no longer an option. So for today, we're going to talk about several different things about being on premises and not moving to the cloud and why you may still want to take that step toward migration. So start with introductions. We're to talk about what we're seeing for our customers who are staying on premises today. And we're going to talk through some major factors that we're seeing why customers may want to move, or where they're spending a lot of money, or where they don't have the elasticity that they may need for the cloud. And then where you can start practically, and then where Netrix can help. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Tom Lilly. I'm our field CTO for cloud solutions here at Netrix Global. I've been here for just over 10 and a half years, and I will be leading today's conversation. Now, when we're talking to our customers, a lot of times they want to stay on premises, or they want to move only a handful of things, or honestly, a lot of times they're just not even sure where to start, or they don't know if they want to move, or they don't know if it makes a lot of sense for them. So when we're having these discussions with our customers, usually we hear three major items, and we can kind of distill them down into the three areas that we see on this slide. So number one is operational expenditure. So when you're on premises, when you have your own data center or server closet, or even considering if you're in a co-location space, you have a capital expenditure. Every 5 years or so, or whatever your hardware refresh cycle is, you have to go to your board, you have to go to your CFO, you have to submit a budget, and you have to essentially just buy that hardware for the duration of that super cycle, depending on how you're refreshing everything. When you move into the cloud, that obviously changes. So when we move into Azure or AWS, we switch into what's called an operational expenditure, or OpEx. What this means is that there's no upfront outlay of any capital. So you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of hardware. But what you can do instead is essentially pay for what you use. If you need to store 2 terabytes of data one month, and then the next month you need to store 3, all you do is you pay for that delta. You don't have to go out and buy another tray of disks. Likewise, if you need to run a larger virtual machine or EC2 instance, you can easily size that up without having to go back to your hardware vendor, add additional nodes to your cluster. You don't have to add, hardware or RAM to your clusters to support additional workloads. It's all just there for you, and that meter is running whenever you have those services deployed. And that meter is going to be based on usage, as I mentioned before. So that could be, as I said, gigabytes of data stored. It could be gigabytes of bandwidth. It could be number of executions of a function. Any of those things are going to be part of that operational expenditure. And for a lot of my customers, they have some real concerns about that. A capital expenditure is a fixed cost. You can depreciate that asset. You know that it's going to, not cost you any money aside from running an operating cost throughout the year, because you've already sunk that money into the environment. Whereas with this operational expenditure that we have in the cloud, a lot of my customers are concerned about runaway bills. Is that cool? 1 month I could be well within my budget, but the next month, maybe I have something unexpected happen, and now my cloud cost unexpectedly doubles. And now I'm the one who has to go back to my CFO or to my board or to my manager, whoever is going to be approving that budget, to justify why the cost went up 10, 20, 30%. So a lot of the customers that we talk to are really concerned about that, the elastic nature of the cloud environments. And they really like the idea of having that capital expenditure and, buy the hardware once and then use it till you're done with it. And then maybe move it into DR, maybe decommission it, maybe donate it, whatever you want to do. But really only have to worry about it that one time. The second major item that we're hearing is legacy applications. Is that, hey, we've had this application that was written for us on premises for so long ago, or maybe it's an off-the-shelf application, and we just don't think it's going to support the cloud. We either don't see a path forward to modernize it, so we don't think we can take care of the cloud as well as we should be able to, or we have concerns that even the hardware that this is running can't be virtualized properly, or maybe there are licensing concerns, and changing the location of the machine is going to break some licensing terms. Maybe it's just so business critical that you don't want to even take the chance of potentially messing up that application itself. So from a lot of our customers that are running more legacy applications, there are some major concerns about compatibility in the cloud. One of the other major areas that we see is anything that's reliant on a mainframe. Anybody who is still running AS400 or is still running any sort of platforms like that aren't easily migrated into the cloud, there are definitely some concerns about pulling your application layer and keeping your data on premises. Because as you increase that latency between your data center and between your mainframe, obviously any data jobs like extract, transform, and load is going to take more time. So if you ever want to move an application that that has one of those components, you definitely want to take that into consideration as you are planning for your migration. And then finally, the last item that we hear is data security and compliance. I'd be curious to see how many people watching this right now have the mindset of, well, my data is within my four walls. I know exactly where it is. I can go and touch a server if I need to. I can go and power it off or yank the power or, take an axe and cut my network cables if, somebody tries to get in. A lot of our customers are really concerned about data security and compliance, not only from an outside hacker, but also inside threats. So, hey, I've got this in a data center somewhere, but I don't know who is managing my hardware. I don't know if somebody can go in and just yank a bunch of disks and now they've got all of my data. I'm concerned that they're not like taking a look at me because I'm a small fish in the ocean, and the odds are that if somebody tries to attack my environment, that one of the hyperscalers isn't going to care. There are things like that a lot of organizations are really concerned about when it comes to security and compliance, that they just feel a lot more secure with having that data within their four walls, at least having direct line of sight to it. They have their own teams that can do their own monitoring, or maybe they partner with an MSSP to do that for them. But at the end of the day, they know exactly where it is. They know what they can do, and they don't really worry about having to have that outside influence within their environment. So let's talk about some of the other things that we're seeing and why moving really starts to make a lot of sense. So we were talking about costing earlier and the switch from a capital to an operational expenditure, and we would be very remiss if we didn't talk about VMware. And I know they're probably everybody's favorite whipping boy right now, but the reason for that is because they keep changing things. So for those of you that are watching this that are still on VMware, stop me if you've heard this one before, that, hey, by the way, you're up for renewal and your costs are going to go up by 500, 600, 800, 1200% because of either a change in licensing terms, a change in core minimums, or just a change because Broadcom feels like it. So since the Broadcom acquisition was closed, what we've seen from a lot of our customers is a significant increase in VMware costs within their environment. And this has really hit a lot of our smaller customers that maybe didn't hit the new core minimums. So now what they have to do is they have to buy additional licensing to hit those 72 cores to be in compliance. And now that has caused them to have a significant increase in their VMware licensing. So I was mentioning some numbers before and some percentages. We have had some of our customers, and I've talked to them specifically, that have had between 12 and 1600% increase in their VMware costs over the years. And that's since the acquisition. And that's really because of what Broadcom has done as part of that acquisition. They're also, offering some less flexibility by sunsetting some products and some free solutions that, people were really taking advantage of to either skill their users up or skill their administrators up, or to run smaller workloads within their environment. So what can you do? And that's one of the main questions that I get from my customers is, hey, we're on VMware. What can we really do? If you want to move to the cloud, there's a couple different ways that you can approach this. So number one is if you're so invested in VMware, but you want to maybe look at cloudifying or modernizing some of your applications, but you're still going to host a preponderance of your workloads on VMware. So both Azure and AWS have native VMware solutions in their cloud. So we have AVS and EVS, not to be confused with each other, but we have an Azure VMware solution, and then we have Elastic VMware Service. So what these services do is they allow you to run VMware in the cloud on Amazon's or Microsoft's hardware, and then essentially purchase that for a longer term. Or if you still have licensing, you can even bring your own licensing in those situations as well. But the reason you may want to do that is because it gets your workloads into one of those clouds. And now as you start to get into modernization, you start to get off of those services, you can certainly start to do that because everything is already out there. Now, if you don't want to just kick the can down the VMware road, you can also do a native migration from from VMware to both Azure and AWS with first-party solutions. And that is also certainly an option that you can take advantage of. But the biggest thing to understand, or the biggest thing to keep in mind here, is that it is time to move. That as you start to have more of these services and the costs keep increasing, that it's going to slowly trickle, and it's going to be sometimes death by 1,000 cuts. That every year, even if the cost doesn't go up by 1,600%, but it's 10% or 15%, that's going to compound over time. So by getting into a cloud solution, by getting into a, especially a cloud native solution that can auto scale, is a great way to sort of control those costs from a licensing perspective for VMware. That being said, one of the other major areas that we're seeing costs increase lately is server hardware. So for those of you who are on this call who have done any sort of pricing or any sort of purchasing of server hardware, you're probably familiar with the increase in a lot of hardware components. So over the last few years, it's been GPUs, it's been these graphics processing units that our customers want to use for AI or ML, or even in their VDIs to provide for higher fidelity graphics for architects and designers and things like that. And that was one of the major things since 2020, since the pandemic, and really the major increase in GPU prices. But what we've really seen over the course of the last, call it 5 to 6 months, is RAM. For those of you who haven't been tracking hardware costs, the cost for server RAM has gone up anywhere between 150 and 300%, depending on the size of the DIMMs and the capabilities of the RAM itself. And that's due to an increased demand, once again, mostly fueled by artificial intelligence, but also because RAM is getting more expensive to manufacture. Either that's because manufacturing is not happening as quickly, or it's just because the new components, the new capabilities that we need out of it are just more difficult to produce, that the cost for that production is going up. Therefore, the cost for actually buying it is also going up. So we're definitely seeing that major increase in the cost. And at the same time, obviously, we're seeing supply chain demands, that because everybody wants RAM, because everybody wants to have their artificial intelligence and their LLMs that are running on their hardware, that we're seeing constraints in that supply chain. That, hey, you may be able to buy RAM, you have to pay 300% for it, but it's not even going to be available for another 6 weeks or another 8 weeks. So now if you're in that on-premises capital expenditure model and you need to add additional RAM to your hosts, and not even add a new full host, you may not be able to do that for several weeks to even a few months, just because of RAM availability. So we're seeing some major pressures from a hardware perspective. And those lead times really kind of get out of that elasticity model that you have on premises with as little as you have. That, hey, if I've got this hardware, I can go just pop a few more DIMMs in there, or I can just add another CPU to it, or I can just add a couple more disks. That's becoming less and less likely as we see some of these larger resource intensive workloads start to be deployed. Whereas in the cloud, because all this hardware is already purchased, we've got tens and hundreds of thousands of servers, if not more, that are back-ending this entire service. So if I need to spin up a machine with 4 CPU and 16 gig of RAM, I can do that really quickly. If I need to spin up something with 128 CPUs and several hundred gigabytes of RAM, I can do that too. I don't have to worry about buying new hardware. I don't have to worry about the wait time. I don't have to worry about the downtime on the host to install that hardware. It's all just available for me as a consumption model in the cloud. So from that perspective, I get a lot more elasticity. And don't even think about that from just deploying new workloads. Also keep that in mind as you have existing workloads that maybe have to scale up or maybe scale down. Especially if your organization has a lot of seasonal usage, which we see a lot with our retail customers, or with a lot of our finance customers that do taxes, because tax day is coming up, or at least it is from the time of this webinar. That being able to scale your workloads up when you really need them to, but then scale them down and not have to pay that extra money is really helpful. And in a CapEx environment, you don't really have that capability, because even if you scale the workloads down, you've already paid for your 72 cores, you've already paid for your 512 gig of RAM. So if you're not using them, then why did you pay for them? It's essentially lost money at that point. So by having the ability to resize workloads and do spin up and spin down as needed, regardless of the lead time and the underlying hardware itself, can be really advantageous for a lot of our customers. And then the same thing that we're also seeing this for legacy applications, as I mentioned before, that hey, you've got these applications that are slow. Maybe they have an outdated design. Maybe as everybody's moving more toward web applications, they're still hosting a traditional client server application. Maybe you're using an outdated version of .NET framework for it. Maybe you're using old libraries. Maybe you've got some insecure middleware in there. All of these things can really reduce your user experience, that as your users sort of get into the environment and as they're working with this application, odds are they're just going to get frustrated because they can't get into it properly, or it's running super slow, or they're not used to the mechanism by which they have to interact with it. That's you're losing productivity as you have those sort of issues with your end users, that if it takes them twice as long to enter a transaction or to work within an application, or to release funds or whatever that app is being used for, that is lost productivity in multiple ways, right? You're not able to invoice your clients as quickly. You're not able to recover funds as quickly. But at the same time, you're also irritating your users. You're also making them less likely and less willing to work in the application. They're going to do whatever they can to work around it. Now, whether that is using an unsanctioned application or whether that is, batch jobbing everything in the end of their day because they just don't want to deal with this old application. In addition, we see a lot of incompatibility and missing features. So, hey, we would really love to add multi-factor authentication. We would really love to add OCR. We'd really love to add these capabilities, but you know what? We really just can't, because the application itself is so old that to update it would be a significant amount of money, or we don't have the hardware to run a proper development environment to see if we can even do these things, or hey, we just don't have the people to go through and make this thing where we think it should be. Or the other thing that I hear a lot is we have the people, but they're too busy dealing with some of the day-to-day tasks. They are expanding disks on virtual machines. They are replacing physical hardware that's failed. They're calling in warranty. They're worried about physical security. So we just don't have the time to develop these new features. We don't have the time to make sure we're on the latest and the greatest. We don't have the time to make sure that these apps are actually allowing and enabling our users to do their jobs in an effective manner. And then finally, from a legacy perspective, we see a lot of security and technical issues. So, hey, what can we do to make sure this environment is properly secured? Well, we're running such an old library that's got so many security holes in it and we can't update it because it's just way too old. Or hey, you know what? We literally just want to keep this thing private because if it's ever exposed to the internet, my Windows Server 2008 R2 backend is going to be immediately attacked. Or hey, this is running on a Windows 10 box because that's what our original vendor decided to do with it. So we do see a lot of these legacy security and technical issues with applications themselves. And one of the things that you can do, and one of the reasons we recommend our clients move to the cloud, is the fact that you can modernize all this into a non-infrastructure platform. So on premises today, you've got a set of physical servers or virtual servers that are all running these services that make up your applications. Web servers, middle tier, backend services, supporting jobs, things like that. All of those servers have to be patched, they have to be monitored, maintained, they have to be updated whenever there's a new version of the Linux distro, whenever there's a new version of Windows Server, or at least whenever they go out of support. So keep in mind, all these updates have to happen. And don't get me wrong, if you move those workloads into the cloud as VMs or as EC2, you're going to have the exact same issues, except for warranties and some of the physical issues. But it's still a VM. Still needs patching, still needs monitoring. You still need to make sure that you've got the right ports open, things like that. However, for a lot of our customers, what they're doing is they're modernizing these applications into platform services. They're running web apps, or they're running Elastic Beanstalk, or they're running Lambda, or they're running Azure Functions, or they're running RDS, or they're running SQL PaaS, or they're running Horizon DB. They're running Aurora. All of these platform services that provide you the same capabilities around data storage, about user presentation, about ETL jobs for your data lake or data warehouse. All these things can be run in the cloud, and once again on this consumption model. If I have a data pipeline that needs to run once a day, then why am I paying for a SQL server that's up 24/7 that's maybe just running integration services? There's no need for you to do that when you can just run for the or pay for the execution, let it run, and then not have to worry about paying for it again tomorrow. In addition, by leveraging some of these platform services, you can also implement things like auto scaling. So I mentioned before that if you have a highly seasonal workload or workforce or customer base, then now we can scale these workloads out. And it's not just seasonal from a month by month perspective. This can be day by day or hour by hour. If you have a workforce that only works for 8 to 5 days a week, then we can take these applications and we can a week then it's nothing during off peak or off hours times. And now you're only paying for a fraction of the size of the hardware, whereas at 7 a.m. every day or whatever that ends up being, we can automatically scale that out to make sure you're ready for your users to start coming in during the day. So by taking advantage of the cloud and moving into the cloud, you can have a more elastic platform that is more cost effective because it does auto scale. It's going to be more performance because it does have some of that scale out and scale in. The other really nice thing about that is because everything is running on platform services, it really lends itself to staying modern. So for example, if I'm running an Azure web app and there's a new version of PHP that comes out, that version of PHP is automatically loaded into the web app. All I have to do is hit a drop down that says I want to use the new version rather than using the old version. There is no management, there's no maintenance of any of that middleware or any of the supporting services. It's all literally done for you within the platform service itself. So now, once you're ready to go, all you have to do is hit that drop down, and now you're running the latest version of whatever that middleware is, whatever that library is. Also, because you don't have to worry about managing and maintaining the physical hardware, that also frees up people and potentially frees up headcount for you to be able to have more developers, to work on new features, to ensure that everybody has a good user experience, that you're not just letting these applications languish. So by doing all of these things, you have this capability to sort of shift some of that responsibility into your cloud providers and to better support your application infrastructure and application architectures to make sure that they're operating as they should be. And then finally, one of the biggest things that I hear is really around security. So hey, once again, my data is in my four walls. I know exactly where it is. I know who's going in and out of my data center or my server closet, whatever you're running. But the main question that I always ask is, are you sure about that? Because as we get into some of the larger hyperscalers, we start talking about the economies of scale. So Microsoft Security Solution, which our MSSP uses as one of our solutions to monitor our clients' environments, is all trained off of the data that hits not just Azure and not just Microsoft 365, but also Bing and Xbox and every single other public Microsoft cloud solution. They are taking in trillions upon trillions upon trillions of signals of data and using that to train and secure their environment. So I don't know about you, but I know we don't have that capability. here internally. We obviously rely on Microsoft for that. And I'm guessing that most of the customers and most of the people listening to this webinar don't have that ability as well. Microsoft also spends tens of billions of dollars every year just on security. I wish our security budget was that high. I'm sure a lot of you do as well. But the fact of the matter is that they're spending all this money on security to make sure their infrastructure is properly monitored and it is maintained. And they can have DDoS built in, and they can have monitoring built in. They can have automated response built in. So they have these capabilities to make sure they've got that security in the environment and to make sure that everything is operating as it should be. So that all goes in that advanced threat detection and response is, hey, we can correlate these trillions of signals into a giant data lake. And hey, we're seeing a major phishing campaign. We're seeing a major password spray campaign. We're seeing a DDoS campaign from these 2,000 IP addresses. They can take at their edge all that information and then automatically block or automatically remediate depending on what happens. Whereas a lot of the customers that we work with, even though they may feel like they're more secure in their four walls, just don't have that breadth, they don't have that scale, they don't have that capability. In addition, the other big thing that we see is patching. Once again, going back to legacy applications. Hey, we're still running Windows Server 2008 R2, or hey, we can't take an outage, even a reboot on this guest machine, so therefore we're not patching everything. So in the cloud, there are a lot of ways that you can undertake automatic patch management. And this goes under two different layers, right? So we've got the underlying infrastructure, the actual hypervisors that the hyperscaler themselves are going to support. So those automatically get patched by them, as needed. So you don't even have to worry about patching your hypervisors. As we get into the guests or guest virtual machines or guest EC2 instances, both hyperscalers also have built-in automated patch management capabilities to make sure that you can, better report on and better implement and better deploy and better restart your servers to make sure they do stay patched. Now, for those of you that do take that extra step up and you get into those platform services, those are also automatically patched. Hey, there's a vulnerability in Kubernetes. There's a vulnerability here. There's a vulnerability there. Those automatically get patched into the underlying containers that run the vast majority of platform services. So once again, no longer do you have to worry about it. This is all done for you by the hyperscaler. And then once again, can help free up your staff, free up your engineers, and free up your architects that no longer have to worry about the day-to-day patch management of some of these services, and they can get into things that really make an impact on the organization. The hyperscalers also provide centralized monitoring and controls. So whether this is the Azure audit logs or whether this is CloudWatch in AWS, whether it is a centralized SIM platform, all of these things start to get aggregated into that area, and you get a lot more visibility, a lot more discoverability. When I talk to my customers about the things that they can see out of their cloud logs, about who's done what and who's trying to access where, what IP address, and getting information on the BGP ASN and what country of origin, I just see eyes light up because they don't have that visibility today unless they've got one of these larger SIM platforms. So by centralizing monitoring, centralizing controls, and then standardizing on that by using solutions like Azure Policy to enforce diagnostic settings, we can ensure that everything does get logged into a centralized location. And once it gets logged into a centralized location, now I can do data visualization, I can do correlation, I can do automated response. I can make sure that my environment is both secured and monitored. Or I could partner with an MSSP like Netrix to do that on my behalf, and then they just escalate to me. On premises, you can do some of these things, but it tends to be a lot harder. You don't have that same visibility into, your hypervisors or into your individual guests, unless you do some really complex and sometimes burdensome logging enablement to start to get that data into that SIM platform, into that centralized data lake. And then finally, we have compliance and data protection. So both Amazon and Microsoft maintain dozens upon dozens of regulatory compliance frameworks for their environment. And some of these are the more common ones, so ISO 27001, for example, or SOC 2 compliance, or GDPR compliance. And some of them are going to be some of the smaller, local compliances as well, depending on where you are throughout the world. All of these are already taken care of for you, at least under that shared responsibility model. So as we start to get into a lot of compliance frameworks, there's a good number of them that have a requirement that you track who goes in, who has physical access to the environment, to who logs in and logs out. So by taking care of this for you, these are items, these are areas that you don't necessarily have to worry about. They're already logged, they're already attested to, and they're already taken care of by your hyperscaler providers. And in addition to this, they will also provide these your attestations of compliance for your auditing teams or governance, risk, and compliance teams to validate that the cloud environment is actually secured, that it is actually being monitored. These things are actually being undertaken, because if they didn't, the hyperscalers who are under a lot of scrutiny from these regulatory bodies would certainly lose their accreditation, would lose their compliance, and they know they don't want to do that, because that results in a lot of lost customers. So hopefully this is giving you an idea of what we're hearing in the environment, and where, in my opinion, and where I think a lot of people here's opinions are, is some misinformation and some areas where we think that some of our customers are misinformed. So the goal here of this section was to sort of go through those items and what we're hearing, and when we talk to our customers about moving, what we generally talk to them about. But the other big question that I hear from my customers is, well, this is all well and good, but I really want to know where to begin. We have this infrastructure, we have these services, and don't even know where to start because we have such sprawl. So let's talk about where you can begin as part of your cloud journey and starting to justify that migration. Number one is assessing your costs. Do you know how much a gigabyte of RAM in your clusters are, or how much a CPU core is, or even getting into how much a kilowatt hour is to support your infrastructure, or your cost per BTU for cooling, or things like that? I'll tell you right now that the overwhelming majority of my customers don't know that number, and some of those they can get pretty easily. Hey, I can go back and see what I paid for RAM or see what I paid for these CPUs, but they're not logging that in a CMDB. They're not logging that in a central location. So they really have no idea what the cost of running their infrastructure is, because they're just looking at this as, hey, it's a sunk cost, or hey, you know what, my data center is going to bill me for this, or my building is going to bill me for this every month, and I really have no control over it. So figuring out your contract costs is really, really important. So number one, gather, organize, and retain your contracts. Once again, whether this is support contracts, whether this is colo contracts, whether this is hardware bills of material, make sure you're saving those and digitizing them. Make sure that you know exactly where they are, because as you start to go into your cloud journey, the real question you're going to get from those that sign the checks is this really going to be more cost effective? Is this really going to be cheaper? How are we going to justify this cost? Once you have your contracts, you know what your bills are, you know what your cost per unit are, that becomes a lot easier conversation. There are also a lot of TCO, or total cost of ownership, calculators out there that allow you to plug these numbers in to give you more accurate visibility into what those costs could be, and what that TCO is from on-premises versus moving into a cloud provider. I mentioned this already, but look at your operational expenditures. Power, cooling, your staff to, once again, take care of warranty items. All those fit into that day-to-day operational cost. Back when I was running data centers, I would probably take 30 to 45 minutes every day just to walk racks and look for failed hardware, and then go and submit RMA requests to the hardware vendors, and wait for the courier, or wait for the part to come back, and now you've got to go in and make sure you pull the right disk, and I've got to reseat it and replace it, wait for RAID to rebuild, and all those kind of things. So all those take time, and all those are operational expenditures, because as an engineer or as a maintenance person who is working in the environment, I could potentially be doing something else that is more valuable to the business. So we're talking about operational costs. Don't just look at your monthly licensing or annual licensing. Don't just look at power, cooling, and what it takes to run the data center. Take a look at your people as well. How much of their time could be spent in once again, making better decisions or being more advantageous to the organization. And then Finally, identify those savings. Are you overpaying for power because there's a lower cost, provider out there that you could potentially go with? Are your servers oversized and therefore you've got too much CPU, and in your next hardware cycle you can size those down? Do you really need enterprise licensing for this service when maybe standard could do? Make sure you're looking at those individual costs, identify those savings, and start to see where you can sort of reduce those areas. Because if you can do it on premises, you can most certainly do it into the cloud. And all this ties into what we call a cloud TCO, or total cost of ownership engagement, as I mentioned before. So by collecting that infrastructure data, by making sure you're taking a look at everything, we can take that and then actually help you with that analysis to say, okay, well, your VMware costs are this, your hardware costs are this, your per CPU, per gig of RAM, per gigabyte of data throughput, all equate out to this. This is what it'd be if you were to move into the cloud through a lift and shift. And we can do that cost comparison for you. So that's to say, okay, well, over 3 years or over 5 years, whatever that number is, your cost for your hardware is going to be this. However, if you were to move into the cloud with some proper safeguards, in effect, then this is what your cost is projected to be there. And that's based on things like right sizing. That's based on what the current cost for some of the resources are in the cloud. That comparison can really help you justify, once again, to your board, to your CFO, to your manager, to whoever's going to approve it, why you should look at moving into the cloud. And a good part of that is optimizing that cloud value. Once again, can we take advantage of reservations or savings plans or auto scaling or less expensive regions throughout the world to better optimize what we are running out there? There are a lot of levers you can pull as you get into the cloud to save and control costs. And this could be, once again, reservations where I'm going to commit to using this, this tier of virtual machine for the next 3 years. Or, hey, I know I'm going to have at least a petabyte of storage out here. Why don't I get a saving on that of 25, 30%? All those optimizations can be taken into account as you go through that TCO engagement. The other biggest thing from an optimization perspective is right sizing. So go in and do an analysis, see how your services are running. Do you have servers that are majorly over provisioned today? I can't tell you how many times I've walked into clients and we deploy an appliance and start to do an assessment, and it turns out their SQL server, which has 64 CPUs and 256 gig of RAM, needs nowhere near that. Maybe it needs only 32 CPUs, or maybe it needs only 16 or 24 CPUs. Maybe it only needs 128 gig of RAM. But when they deployed the server, they want to make sure that, okay, we want to make sure we've got enough headroom in this. We want to make sure we have enough performance because this application is business critical. Therefore, we're going to majorly over provision this server. Well, on premises, that's fine if you have the hardware to support it. But in the cloud, keep in mind that you're paying for every core. You're paying for, every gigabyte of RAM as part of that running cost of the VM. In addition, keep in mind that services like SQL Server and Windows Server are licensed on a per core basis. So if you have 64 cores in your SQL Server and you only need 16, then you can essentially drastically save on your SQL Server licensing or Windows Server licensing because you don't have to license those additional 32 cores or whatever that number ends up being. So there are a lot of different ways that by optimizing your environment prior or during any sort of migration, that you can optimize the value and optimize the cost of moving into the cloud. And then finally, before you move, we highly recommend you implement some sort of cloud proof of concept. Number one, define objectives. A lot of our customers, as we talk to them, just say, well, I want to move to the cloud. Awesome. What does that mean for you? Does it mean you're modernizing applications? Does it mean you want more elasticity? Does it mean you want to take advantage of more cloud native features? Does it mean you want better visibility? Does it mean you want to, have an increase in performance, or maybe just not a decrease in performance? Define those objectives as you get in or before you get into the proof of concept and adhere to them. Know what success looks like, because if you don't know what success looks like, odds are you're never going to find it. So by having those objectives, by ensuring you know exactly what a good POC is going to do for you, means that you know what you want to get out of it. Be as explicit as you can also. Have test plans, have validation plans. Make sure that those objectives map not only to technical controls, but business KPIs or business requirements. Make sure you're bridging that gap to make sure that what you're implementing makes a lot of sense for you as an organization and your users as the people who have to leverage these solutions as they get migrated. One of the biggest areas and one of the biggest objectives that we generally see is performance. So, hey, is my performance better now that I can move onto newer hardware? Or now that I can size this virtual machine up because now I've got the extra room for it. Or the flip side that we do see as well is, hey, you know what? Now that these servers are a little further away, I've got a higher latency between my users and this workload. Is that an issue? Is that, a negative impact on my user experience? All of these sort of assessments, both positive and negative, are extremely important as you're going through this cloud POC. Obviously, as I've been talking on this webinar today, for a lot of my customers, moving to the cloud is a major positive for them with those right controls in place. But that's not to say that's right for everybody. So do make sure that you don't have rose-colored glasses on, but at the same time, don't be overly pessimistic as well. Take your objectives and take your assessments at face value. This is good. This is bad. How do they even out in the end? Don't just try to push your organization to go to the cloud because we want to be in the cloud. Don't just try to stay on premises because you're concerned about your existing hardware, things like that. Be objective about it and make sure you're doing these assessments, especially around things like performance, very, very fairly. And then scalability is the other one. So we've talked a little bit about elasticity today. Can I increase the server size? Can I scale the solution out? Can I, take better advantage of these services? That sort of goes along with the fourth item on this slide as well, of identifying those modernization candidates. Because if I have a web app that I can now do auto scaling for, not only does it become more scalable, but it becomes a lot easier to manage and maintain. Once again, reduce patching and better integration with the fabric and things like that. So make sure you're identifying some of those candidates as you get out of your environment. One of the major things that we see is file servers. It's just an SMB endpoint. We're just accessing it through UNC. I really don't want to be in the business of managing and maintaining and patching just a file server to host files for my users. So why don't we take a look and move that to Azure Files? Why don't we move that to OneDrive or SharePoint? All those are considered modernizations, even though you're not really changing the user experience at all, but you are changing that backend. You're getting out of the VM business, you're getting out of the EC2 instance, you're getting out of the server business, whatever you want to say at that point. So take a look at those candidates. And then, if you have time during the POC to try and do modernization, that's where you really start to get into some of the benefits of moving into the cloud from a performance, from a scalability, and from a security perspective. So execute those cloud proofs of concept, have a good idea of what you're looking for, and at the end of the day, see whether it makes sense for you. I'm not here to say that every customer, once again, should move to the cloud or should move everything to the cloud. Maybe you should be in a hybrid environment. Maybe you should move DR or backup or lower non-production environments. Maybe you should move client-facing applications instead of internal-facing applications. All of those things fit into this cloud proof of concept, or even an assessment to figure out what should move. And that gets into my last slide here today of how we here at Netgex Global can help you move into the cloud or assess whether you even should. And that first one, and I've said it multiple times, I'm going to say it again, perform an assessment. Take a look at the environment, bring in an expert like us to take a look at your environment. See what can move, what shouldn't move, what's a great candidate for modernization. Get some actionable findings about, hey, this would be a good first mover, or hey, you know what, the complexity of this one means that you probably shouldn't move it right now, but maybe you can modernize it in the future, or hey, this can probably be retired and you don't even need it anymore, or hey, move this in your Microsoft 365 licensing, things like that. Let us help you go through that migration assessment to determine what can, should, or should not move. We have experts across the entire gamut of what I've talked about today that can help you make those determinations. Once you choose to move or move some workloads, the other thing that you should also do is deploy what's called a landing zone in the environment, or out of AWS, a solution we call Robotize. So what this is a foundation of security and standardization and visibility and monitoring, including cost monitoring of the environment, that as you migrate workloads into the cloud, you have all of those things already set in place, that it's not wild, wild west. And now people are deploying giant services that we know nothing about. You have no visibility into who did it, or what application this is for, what the life cycle is for it, et cetera. By having this secure foundation in place through a landing zone, through our robotized solution, we have this ability to ensure that you have all of that information at your fingertips. So now, if you are concerned about, rising or surprise costs, you are worried about security, that is a great way to essentially ensure that you've got everything available to you, and you can minimize that risk of, surprise bills or, customer intrusion into the environment. Finally, if you are going to move, a cloud migration makes a lot of sense too. We can help you move workloads in the cloud as a lift and shift or a rehost migration. We can help you modernize your applications if you want to take advantage of newer frameworks or platform services, or even net new builds. We have a lot of our customers who really want to implement a data lake, and they just don't have the storage to do it on premises. And we're coming in and having conversations around Microsoft Fabric and about S3, and about building these data lakes on the cloud that become that sort of central repository. So whether it is a net new application that you want to develop and deploy in the cloud, or you want to take what you have today and migrate it through best practice into a cloud environment, our teams have a significant amount of experience to be able to do that. And then finally, for those of you who aren't quite convinced yet that you want to stay on premises, that you have regulatory or hard reasons that you need to do that, and you just know you can't move, but you do want to stay on premises, we can absolutely help there too. We have an entire modern data center team that can talk to you about staying on premises and about modernizing that infrastructure, whether that is to get rid of VMware to reduce those costs, whether that is to enable solutions like Azure Arc to better cloud integrate or cloudify your on-premises servers. We have teams that can talk about that can help lead you through those services, and it can help modernize that data center as you live on premises. Once again, whether that's moving off of VMware into Hyper-V or Azure Local, whether that's moving into our private cloud solution, or whether that's just taking your existing workloads and cloud attaching them. Our teams are happy to discuss the options, pros, cons, and help you make a decision about what makes sense for your organization. Or if none of those make any sense, call us anyway. Let's talk about the cloud. We do a lot of custom solutions for those that are prior to their migration, during their migration, or even years after their migration, about optimizing their environment, about helping to assess, helping to modernize, et cetera. So even if any of these four major areas don't appeal to you, give us a call. We're always happy to talk about what your needs are and how we can help as an organization. We do a lot more than just cloud. Obviously, this webinar here is really focused on one very specific area, but we are always happy to talk to our customers about what they need and then how we can help them moving forward. So with that, that is the end of our webinar. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Once again, my name is Tom Lilly, Field CTO for Cloud Solutions here at Netrix. Hope everybody has a great day, and thanks again.